Planting trees. How many of you have planted trees before? All right? Planting trees, fun or hard? Depends how big the tree is, and it also depends on what kind of equipment you're using. If it's arm and hammer that you're using, just your own body, it's very hard. I like saving money. Anyone else out here like saving money? I love saving money. We had to plant 4 trees in our backyard. Got rid of a play set, had some open area, wanted to plant some trees that would provide some shade longer after I'm dead. And so we were looking in the backyard, and we thought, you know what? I really like tulip trees. They're native here. They grow fast. They're hardy trees. And you know what our back door here has? Lots of little tulip trees, like, about this big around, 6 to 8 foot high. I'm like, I'm going to save me $30. I'm going to go get me a tulip tree. So I got my shovel, and I got all ready to come out here and dig up this small little tulip tree. Do you know what I found out very early on? That small little tulip tree in Indiana clay does not come out easily. I probably spent about 5 minutes before I'm like, this is stupid. In 5 minutes, I made no progress on the soil. I hadn't even gotten to the roots yet, and I realized this small little precious tree, when it's not in a nursery where they put it in a pot where the roots can't go anywhere, it's very difficult to dig up. Even a small tree planted in decent soil will develop a root system that, as I'm told, it's as big under the ground as it is above the ground. Very difficult to get just even a small tulip tree out of soil when it's established itself. Into that context, we come across this verse in Hebrews. It says this, Hebrews 12:14-15. It says, "Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God." Now watch this next verse. "Lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled." We're starting off in a series on navigating the roadblocks of life. And what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be preaching on some topics that, frankly, most of us come across at some point in our life, whether it be lust, forgiveness, today bitterness, different things that can come up in our life that can, if you will, detour us from God's will for our life. Detour us, put us in, if you will, ditches that will get us hung up for days, weeks, years, sometimes even decades. And one of those roadblocks that we come across is this sin of bitterness. And Hebrews does a very good job of saying bitterness forms, if you will, roots. This last couple weeks ago, we got to see on display the human heart, didn't we? In Las Vegas, as who knows if it's a lone gunman or if there's more going on there, but this individual took out around 50 individuals at a country concert and wounded 100 plus more. It reminds me a lot of when, if you will, as a country, our innocence was lost back during the Columbine shootings. Remember that day waking up and hearing about Eric, and I can't remember his friend's name, Dylan, going into school and literally shooting up their classmates. I remember there was a part of us that died that day. As the reports came in, they started attributing it to bullying. These kids were bullied. These kids were kind of outsiders. And that feeling of anger, inadequacy, or whatever it was, developed, I believe, what you'd call roots of bitterness and resentment. And eventually, they gave fruit to a mass killing. The reality is that's not the last mass killing that's happened since then. And what I want to share with you today is I believe the same sin that can cause individuals like Eric and Dylan to be kind of below the radar and all of a sudden be thrust on the scene and kill classmates and teachers, it stems from a bitterness that can develop in anyone's lives, and eventually the fruit of that bitterness can lead to things such as murder, suicide, and we'll go through some other things that can happen. Bitterness is a real thing. It is a real sin, And as believers in Jesus Christ, God has the remedy for it. But we need to go to his word. We need to deal with these roots of bitterness that can develop in anyone's lives. The book of Romans says this, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Colossians 3:19 is an interesting verse, says this, husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them. I don't have a chance to unpack that verse completely today, but I would say, men, put it on your radar. Paul calls us out and says, love your wife and don't let roots of bitterness grow towards your spouse. James 3:14 says this, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31 and 32 says this, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, but instead be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. What is bitterness? I'll give you a few definitions. Merriam-Webster defines it this way. It's a deep-seated ill will. The Oxford Dictionary puts it this way. It's anger and disappointment at being treated unfairly. Another synonym is just simply resentment. The Greek word from which that we translate into bitterness, the definition for that is a state of sharp, intense resentment or hate. Probably one of the phrases I like best when it comes to bitterness is this. Bitterness is the poison one swallows hoping the other person dies. Have you ever struggled with bitterness in your life? I'll be transparent with you. Bitterness is not one of the sins that I struggle with a lot, but I have found this. I absolutely do have smaller root systems of bitterness that express themselves in ways of when a person I'm interacting with, their past history of how they've treated me comes up in my feelings towards them, how I translate what they say to me, how do I look at what they do to me or to others. And bitterness is something that every person in this room at some point or another has to learn to deal with biblically. And Hebrews gets it dead on when it says, lest any root of bitterness springing up. The reality is bitterness is one of those things that is happening, if you will, below the surface. Sometimes it's growing and you're unaware of the bitterness. Ever had that moment when someone comes to you and says something and the feeling you have back is disproportional to what they just told you? You are, instead of being a little upset at what they said, you are just flat out enraged by what they said. It wasn't because of the one thing they just told you. It's because maybe unbeknownst to you, a root of bitterness towards them had been developing, had been taking root, and it now becomes the filter by which you translate everything they say to you through. I'm not a very good drawer. That's actually the best I can do with time for drawing a tree. But what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of walk through, if you will, the anatomy of bitterness. And so follow along with me. I've got a much better graphic behind me and in your bulletin. But can anyone guess what this is right here? It's a tree. Good, good. This wasn't a trick question. It's just a bad drawing. So what I want to start with here is on this tree, if I were to point right here, sometime in this tree's past, what happened there? A seed. And what I'm going to put here, and you can put in your outline, is this word, or these words, seed of offense. When it comes to bitterness, here's how it usually begins. Someone sins against you, treats you wrongly, they do something that offends you, if you will, that seed hits the soil of your heart. So seed of offense, and then what can begin to happen if there's an unforgiving spirit, if there's not a dealing with it, what will happen is bitterness will begin to take root in your life. Those roots go deep. And from those roots, eventually what will happen is this tree will start producing fruit. In the book of Galatians, it talks about the works of the flesh. If you want to put this in your outline, you can. And the Bible says in Galatians 5, the works of the flesh are evident. It lists many: hatreds, murder, adultery, fornication. What happens when someone offends you and you choose not to forgive, but instead you choose to internalize that anger, you choose to internalize that hurt? What will eventually happen is roots of bitterness will go deep. And this is something we know about trees, especially fruit trees, or specifically fruit trees, is they will produce fruit. Apple trees produce what? Apples. Not my apple trees, but most people's apple trees. Pear trees will produce what? Pears. This is not a trick question. Cherry trees will produce? Okay. So if you have bitterness developing in your root system of your heart, what will eventually be produced, if you will, on the tree of your life? What will be some of those fruits? I'm going to give you guys a chance to interact here. If bitterness is being harbored in your life, what are some of the fruits that will naturally work their way out? Okay, anger is a huge one. We're going to be dealing with anger here in a few weeks. Disrespect is a huge one. And if you're taking notes, you can start like putting fruit all over your tree, but leave half of it for me, okay? Because half of it will be for the good stuff. All right, so anger, disrespect, what else? Hatred, absolutely. You guys are really good at these bad fruits. What? Prejudice is huge. Prejudice at the heart is what? Prejudging. Usually we think of in terms of what we look at as the race wars today or different ethnicities, but prejudice really is anyone walks in despite their color, their gender, whatever else, and I have prejudged them before the first word comes out of their mouth. Might be how they dress, where I meet them at. Prejudice. What else? We don't like controversy in the church. All right, go ahead. Absolutely, if you go to the book of Psalms, you'll see that it can produce ulcers, it can produce heart issues, health issues. Absolutely, bitterness can absolutely kill you physically. Bob? Okay, lack of forgiveness. Another synonym for bitterness, I think that is resentment, which really is, bitterness or resentment is a lack of forgiveness that continues to go on and on and on. What are some of the other fruits? Disobedience, okay? And I'm glad I'm writing these up here because you can all read these, can't you? They're amazing. You guys have x-ray vision. All right, what else we got in the back? Don't move too much, Sam, or I'm going to think I'm calling on you. Go ahead.
Difficulty in relationships.
Yes, that's a huge one. Relationships. And I put this in my notes. You'll have broken relationships, which is the obvious one. You'll also have fake relationships. Do you have some of those? Person comes along and you would not care at all if you never saw them again. They come along, hey, how you doing? Give them a big hug. Hope you're doing great. How are the kids? And you walk away like, I wish that person would never see me again. Maybe I'm the only person who's ever struggled with that. But the reality is you will have fake relationships. You will also have shallow relationships. The reality is bitterness is the product of unforgiveness. If you don't learn how to forgive, you will never have a deep relationship with another human being because eventually that human being will sin against you. There is no such thing as a long-term relationship where you are not offended by the other person because we are sinners in a broken world. If you don't learn how to forgive, you will eventually develop bitterness. And the thing about bitterness is it doesn't get isolated to one or two relationships. It may start in one or two, but it'll eventually trickle into the other ones as well. What else can develop? Yes?
I would say depression or sadness.
Depression is a huge one. And the natural end of depression is self-inflicted death. It's suicide. The reality is, if you look at anger, we'll talk about this in a few weeks, anger usually takes one of two forms, negative forms, bad forms. One is it will be upset and it will attack the one who offended you. The other one is it'll get upset and it'll internalize that anger. So what happens is you are hurt the first time and you continue to hurt yourself because you internalize the anger. Instead of directing at fixing the problem, you direct it at self. So one is the guy who gets upset and punches you in the face and the problem's over. It's not a good thing, but it's kind of one and done. The other one is I am mad at you. I hope you die, and I'm going to keep thinking about it and thinking about it. And that one sin turns into days, weeks, months, even years of internalized anger that will oftentimes blow up either into inflicting murder or hate on someone else or murder and hate on yourself. Bob?
At some point in time, it has an impact on the business.
Absolutely. Your witness for Christ. Bitterness is a sin that I believe every person at some point has to deal with. We live in a fallen world, and no matter how close you're walking to Christ at that moment, there are times where your own sinful desires takes priority over the Spirit of God working in you, and this idea of this root of bitterness has the propensity, has the opportunity to start putting its roots in. Have you met that person who seems to be constantly angry? That person who seems to be constantly negative? That person who seems to almost never have joy, never have happiness, never have peace? In almost every circumstance, what I can do is I can point you to, at some point, there was a seed of offense and bitterness set in. And the interesting thing about bitterness, it can be directed at so many different things. It can be directed at people. It can even be directed at inanimate objects. I'm so mad at my job. Like, really? Your job? Your job's like an inanimate object. How can you get mad at that? You get in a car accident, you get mad at your car for not stopping in time, which is actually getting mad at you. A lot of times what will happen is people get bitter at God. When they can't put a face with the offense, when they can't put a face with the problem they're struggling with, they'll get bitter at God. Bitterness absolutely is a sin that when it takes root, it will produce all kinds of varieties of fleshly works that don't bring honor to God, and they absolutely will destroy you. I didn't realize I was going to fill up this page, and I was supposed to have a second side that had the other stuff. So imagine with me in your head, because I'm not going to try to draw another tree because it won't be any better than this one. On the other side of your outline is a set of arrows. Anyone want to guess what would go in that blank right there? The exact same seed, isn't it? Seed of offense. So the seed of offense comes, but instead of choosing bitterness, you choose a heart of forgiveness. We'll talk about forgiveness. Actually, next week, I believe Terry's dealing with forgiveness. The reality is a heart of forgiveness is different than just blanket forgiving. If someone sins against you, you need to have a heart that is willing to forgive. But just like Jesus doesn't forgive the sins of all, he forgives the sins of all who what? Believe. So forgiveness is really an attitude, is a posture of the heart saying, I am willing to forgive, which requires biblical confrontation. If someone sins against you, if you can't just simply cover that offense, you must go to that person, tell them their offense, and seek reconciliation with them. But you have, if you will, roots of a heart of forgiveness. And those roots need to run deep, because you will be offended in a fallen world. As those roots run deep, what kind of fruit is produced by a heart of forgiveness? If you look behind me, you'll see. What is it? So the works of the flesh, it's the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, patience is in there, peace. In fact, in Hebrews 12, it says what? Pursue peace with all people. And it's in that same context as don't let a root of bitterness come in. Peace, I would believe, is the key factor or the key fruit of a person who is bitter. There is no peace. There's not peace when they lay their head down at night because they're hoping someone else dies. There's not peace when they see people because they're bitter against them. A person who is bitter will have very little joy, and they will have no peace. The reality is a person who has a heart of forgiveness has love for God and for others. A person who has a heart of forgiveness, according to God's word, is going to have joy. And it's not a fake smile joy. It's a joy that says, man, my God forgave me so much. It's a small thing to forgive you these little offenses. There's joy and there's peace. There's something amazing about being able to lay your head down at night and know that to the best of your ability, to the best of your knowledge, you are right with God and you're right with God's children. It brings peace. And what I want to do is I want to take about 10 minutes and I want to give you a total of 4 stories from the Old Testament. 2 that will demonstrate the works of the flesh and the seed of offense. The other side that will give you what does a heart of forgiveness look like. The first one we're going to go to, looking at the ages in here. All right, ages in here. So I think we're good. The first one is the Dinah incident. This is an interesting story. If you have your Bibles, turn back to Genesis chapter 34. Once you get there, go ahead and kind of skim through that story, and let me give you the highlights. In Genesis 34, there is this young lady named Dinah. Dinah is a beautiful girl, and it says this, "Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her, lay with her, violated her." His soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman, spoke kindly to the young woman. That is an interesting juxtaposition of those 2 words, because his first act was not an act of love, it was a criminal act of rape. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. What happens next is Hamor seeks to take Dinah as his wife. And when he goes to do that, if you jump down to verse 13, "But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father and spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah their sister. They said to them, 'We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us.' So the brothers get together and they have a plan. The plan is, all right, you want my daughter or you want our sister? We've got a plan. We can't have uncircumcised people being married into our family, so all the men of this town, you're going to get circumcised." Somehow, they agree to this. And so the entire town of adult men gets circumcised. I believe it's on day 3 when they're in the worst pain. The sons of Jacob come in and they wipe out all the men in that city. Where did that come from? A heart of bitterness came in, which led to deceit, which led to a lack of forgiveness, to a bitterness, to a hatred, which eventually led to cold-blooded murder. What happened in that story is justice that you'd see in a Hollywood movie, but not justice that you'd see from a holy God. There was a sinner in this. It wasn't the entire town. In fact, by the end of it, instead of dealing with the sin properly, what happens is these men take justice in their own hands. They create a justice that is not just, and they kill an entire city of men through deceit. What does bitterness lead to? Its ultimate end is murder. Let me give you another story. It's the story of Joseph. You know the story well. Joseph is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Brothers don't like him. In fact, they hate him. They hate him so much that one day when he goes out to check on their flocks, they take him, throw him in a pit, plan to kill him. They decide instead of killing him, we'll sell him into slavery. They sell him into slavery. He spends 14 years as a slave and as a prisoner. God miraculously removes him from prison, puts him as second in command of Egypt, and his brothers come from Israel because of a famine. And Joseph, when he sees his brothers, instead of killing them, what does he do? He blesses them with food. He blesses them with a new place to live during the time of famine. Joseph, over the top, instead of killing his brothers, which is what they deserved, he blessed them. You get to the end of Genesis chapter 50. Here's what Joseph says. Verse 19, Joseph's fathers passed away. The brothers are terrified that Joseph now is going to extract his revenge. They're assuming what had developed in Joseph's life was deep roots of bitterness. And he was hiding them below the surface for the moment his dad died, and then he can come in and he can kill them all. Joseph said to them, verse 19, Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? Isn't that a great starting point? When we talk about bitterness, what are we saying? I am God, and I will extract my pound of flesh for your sin against me. Joseph says, I'm not God. I'm not in his place. It's God's job to judge. It's God's job to make that which was unjust just. And he says this, now, but as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for what? Good, in order to bring about, as it is to this day, to save many people alive. Joseph, instead of bitterness, chose a heart of forgiveness. And he forgave his brothers of an unforgivable sin. They literally sold him into slavery and said, no more. We don't want to ever see you again. I don't care how they treat you. And the life of a slave does not normally end like it did for Joseph. It doesn't end with you becoming second in command in Egypt. It ends with you having a hard, difficult, and probably short life. And you own nothing. You are told what to do. You have no freedoms. And eventually you die. But instead of bitterness, what did Joseph choose? He chose a heart of forgiveness. And his brothers are not an isolated event. The first place he goes, Potiphar's house. He literally does the right thing. Potiphar's wife tries to sleep with him, and he runs and leaves his jacket behind. Potiphar's wife lies. He does the right thing. The woman lies, and he goes to jail for another 7 years. Can you imagine? Like that's a recipe for bitterness that's over the top. But is that what you see with Joseph? You even think about when he gets a chance now to get elevated. As if you know the story, Pharaoh has this dream. Pharaoh comes to Joseph after Joseph for 2 years sat in prison when the cupbearer was supposed to get him out. When Pharaoh comes, his first words aren't, that cupbearer of yours is a stupid liar. In Hebrew, it's something other than stupid. It's Nabal. That has nothing to do with the message. Sorry. That's what it is, though. Exactly. Instead of calling out the cupbearer, or instead of saying, yeah, Pharaoh, I got this, he says, I can't interpret your dreams. Only God can. He interprets the dream, gives the plan to Pharaoh. Hey, Pharaoh, you need to save up food for those 7 years of much, and then you'll have something for those 7 years where there's famine. You need to go find a wise man for this. He doesn't say, and I'm the man for the job, does he? He says, you need to go find someone who can do this. And Pharaoh says, the guy is you. Like you would think a person who's been treated this way would be working every angle he could to get ahead. But instead of bitterness, Joseph chose a heart of forgiveness. That goes contrary to every fiber of our fleshly being. When we are treated unjustly, we want to exact our justice. When the justice system is corrupt or too slow, we want to find a way to make it right in our own time frame, in our own ways. Let me give you two more illustrations. The next one is found in 2 Samuel. Actually, 2 Samuel chapter 2. There are these three brothers, Asahel, Abishai, and Joab. And they have sided with King David. We're right now in a place in Israel where Saul has died, and David is setting up the United Kingdom in Israel. Not the UK, but the United Kingdom of Israel, all 12 tribes. In this process, there's this guy named Abner. He's one of the generals. And instead of siding with David, he sides with Ishbosheth, one of Saul's children. And there is, if you will, a battle between the two going on. And these three brothers, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Asahel is one of the 30 mighty men of David's. They're running after Abner. Abner says, turn away. Quit chasing me. At some point, Abner says, I'm done with this. And he drives the end of his spear through Asahel, and Asahel dies there on the side of the road. He bleeds out. You now have two brothers left, Joab and Abishai. As the story progresses, Ishbosheth isn't very nice to Abner. Abner says, you know what? I'm done with you. He sides with David. David makes an alliance with Abner and brings Abner, if you will, into the fold. So Abner, Joab, and Abishai should now be working together. That's the plan. But instead of that plan happening, the two brothers, Joab and Abishai, come up with a plan, say, you know, Abner, come over here. We need to tell you something in private. And what do you think they do? They murder him. Why? Instead of a heart of forgiveness, which I understand, in this situation, that'd be hard to forgive, wouldn't it? But the person who makes the laws, who makes the rules, was King David. And King David, by his alliance, said, leave this guy alone. I don't like what happened either, but we're going to grant, if you will, not clemency, but we're not going to hold him accountable for this. It was an act of war. We're going to move on. We're going to turn the page. Instead of turning the page, what happens? There's hatred, there's resentment, there's murder. Bitterness takes us to places that we never thought possible. I really don't think Joab and Abishai thought, you know what, someday I would like to grow up and be a murderer. I don't think that was on their to-do list. I don't think that was on their 5-year strategic plan. But bitterness will take us places we never intended to go. Let me give you an example that's just the exact opposite of that. And we're going to keep in the same passage if you have your Bibles, 2 Samuel, and go to chapter 9. And it is one of the most beautiful stories in all the Old Testament. King Saul, Jonathan, they're dead. But Jonathan has a son. His name is Mephibosheth. He is lame in his feet. Typically, when there's a new monarch in place, you need to kill off all the previous monarch's kids. In fact, typically, the brothers would take care of that. So Jonathan's son would kill off all the other brothers so that he would have the rightful place to the throne and nobody else could challenge for it. King David, from a completely different line, now takes the throne in Israel. And he says, I want you to find, are there any relatives of Jonathan? Are there any relatives of Saul? And when David goes to Mephibosheth, instead of killing him, here's what he does. 2 Samuel chapter 9. And let's look at verse 6. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, here's your servant. So David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. And then verse 11, the second part says this, as for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Verse 13, so Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. King Saul, on multiple occasions, tried to kill David. When David now has the opportunity to take care of Saul's line, instead of wiping out Saul's line, he takes this helpless Mephibosheth and restores to Mephibosheth land that rightfully should have been King David's. He says, I'm going to let you keep your dad's lands, your grandfather's lands. And there's a table that's set up for just the royalty in Israel. You're going to sit at that table. Can you imagine? That's the type of forgiveness that I want to have in my home, in my church, on the boards that I serve on. That type of forgiveness leads to love that doesn't make sense, joy that can't be explained, peace that allows you to put your head down at night and say, it is well with my soul. What does bitterness look like in our lives? As I thought through this, I don't think I've ever had bitterness develop to such a level that I wanted to kill someone. I don't think it's ever happened. But I do know this, bitterness left unchecked will absolutely lead you to those places. What I found is that my style of bitterness is typically a prejudging when someone comes and speaks to me. Because of their past history, I know what they want or what they don't want. I know how they're going to treat me or not treat me. And so I will prejudge the intents of their heart before they ever say a word. And I'm pretty sure I'm not alone. What's really ugly is I start looking, I go, man, this happens not just in groups like this or the community. It happens in my own home. That bitterness can literally develop in my own home with people that I'd be willing to die for. I can prejudge the motives of their conversations. And I'm pretty sure I'm not alone. I see it in teenagers as they prejudge the motives of their parents, as they assume the worst about their parents. I see it with grown children who are out of the house and are unwilling to forgive their parents for how their parents failed them. I see it with parents who feel like they're disrespected by their children. Instead of pursuing forgiveness and restoration, they instead choose bitterness, self-righteousness, alienation. Have you been there before? It's a lonely place to be, isn't it? Not a lot of love there. Not a lot of joy there. Not any peace there. So what's the remedy? I think Ephesians 4 that we read earlier gives us the remedy. Ephesians 4, verse 32. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. If you would go to the next slide. We started with this. Bitterness is a poison one swallows, hoping the other person dies. I'd add this statement to it. If bitterness is a poison one swallows, hoping the other person dies, then forgiveness is the antidote to the poison of bitterness. Are you dealing with bitterness in your life? Has it put you in the ditch of life? The starting point is this: forgiveness. If you don't know what that looks like, commercial next week, Terry's going to talk about it. So don't miss next week, because Terry's going to talk about forgiveness, what it looks like, how do we do it in a biblical way, how do we start knocking out these roots of bitterness and replace them with deep roots of a heart of forgiveness. God, you've been good to us. We thank you that through your word we understand that bitterness is a sin that must be dealt with. Father, when the roots get in, it is hard to pluck them out. But we thank you that through your Son, we have been forgiven much. And because of your Spirit working in us, we can choose to forgive others. Lord, I pray for us this next week that we'd be really considering what roots of bitterness have developed in our lives. That you would help us to begin the process of seeking restoration and forgiveness. Lord, I pray even now for Terry as he is prepared to teach on forgiveness next week. I ask, God, that you'd give him the right words to say from your word, and that you'd bring us back next week with hearts that are ready to hear what your word says about forgiveness. Help us to be like your Son, Jesus.